Welcome everyone. One of the questions I get asked often is, how do I configure a Bootstrap client to install Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, or the free open source version from VMware called Tanzu Community Edition, TCE? So in this short video, I will run through the process to configure a Bootstrap client machine running Linux, with the goal of being able to then install Tanzu Community Edition. I've chosen Rocky Linux, specifically 8.6, as the distribution to configure our Bootstrap client on. So just to clarify, we won't be doing a deployment of Tanzu Community Edition in this video. We are just focusing on the Bootstrap client, getting us to a point where our client machine has all the tools required for a successful install of a TCE cluster. The actual deployment, we'll cover that in another video. Now, before we start the configuration, let's just set the scene a little first and describe what our installation will look like. I've installed Rocky Linux 8.6. I've performed a server installation with GUI and didn't select any additional packages. And that's what you're seeing on the screen right now. Go ahead and open up a web browser now. And let's head over to the Tanzu Community Edition website. And let's go over to the documentation page. Version 0.12 is the current latest version available. Let's head over to Getting Started and plan your deployment. Have a good read of this section. Make sure you understand the different deployment models available to you. TCE can be deployed in a few different ways. We can deploy management clusters, unmanaged clusters, or we can deploy with Docker Desktop. We're going to be targeting a deployment with managed clusters. So we're going to be setting up our Bootstrap client for that. Deploying managed clusters will give you the full experience of using Tanzu Community Edition. When the time comes to deploy, you will have the option to deploy to Azure, AWS, or vSphere. You're going to get management clusters along with workload Kubernetes clusters. You're going to get that full feature-rich experience of using Tanzu Community Edition with managed clusters, as opposed to running unmanaged clusters or with Docker Desktop, where you will get a kind cluster running on Docker, which will be just on your local desktop. But that's a video for another time. With all that said, let's finally go ahead and open up a terminal window and start the configuration of our system. Let's just make our prompt a little bigger. The first thing that we need to do is install Docker CE. So we're going to run a few different commands to make that happen. So the first thing that we need to do is set our repo to download Docker CE. And then we'll actually install it using DNF. And after we install it, we will start the Docker service. And once we start the service, we will check to make sure that the service is running. Next, we want to be able to run Docker as a non-root user. So we will just confirm that there is a Docker group, and then we will add ourselves to that Docker group. And at this point, you are supposed to log out of your session, ideally reboot the computer so that new group and yourself added to that group can take effect. However, we can save a little bit of time and just run this command for our current session. And now we can just check if Docker has installed, and we can just run a simple Docker hello world. So this will go ahead and pull down hello world. And it's a pretty basic and good test just to make sure that Docker has installed successfully. So we have Docker now running on our installation, on our Bootstrap client. This is one of the main prerequisites that we needed. What is not needed at this point is Docker Compose. However, I do like to sometimes do this. So we will also just run this as well. Now this is optional. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but it's nice to have Docker Compose along with Docker. And now we can just go ahead and just make sure that Docker Compose is okay, and it is. So that's it. We've got Docker CE, Docker Compose. We have two options now to actually install Tanzu Community Edition. We can do it via Brew, or we can download the files from GitHub. I'm going to use Brew in this case, but to use Brew, that does not come with Rocky Linux, so we need to install a few development tools and then Brew to make it work. So we're going to do that now. So the first thing is we're going to install some development tools. And this will take a few minutes, so we'll just speed through this very quickly. Okay, once the installation of the development tools are complete, we also need to install Git. Or at least confirm that Git is installed, which it is. And now we can go ahead and we can install Brew. This will take a few minutes to install, so let's just go ahead and speed through this. With the installation of Brew complete, there's two commands that we just need to run, which are highlighted here for us. And with that complete, we can now actually install Tanzu Community Edition with Brew, or leveraging Brew. And just like Brew, this will take a few minutes, so we'll go ahead and fast forward through this to save a bit of time. Tanzu Community Edition has been installed. There is just one command that we need to run, which is this one right here. So we'll just go ahead and run that now. One thing that's also a good idea to install is kube control, because after we install Tanzu Community Edition, we will also want to use kube control. So it's probably a good idea to also install this as well. Let's just go ahead and make sure that kube control is working, which it is. And that is it for the configuration of the Bootstrap client to install Tanzu Community Edition. So we installed Docker CE along with the optional extra Docker Compose. We installed Brew along with some development tools to make Brew work successfully and install packages. And we install the Tanzu Community Edition components, so we can now go ahead and run Tanzu Community Edition to ultimately deploy clusters, management clusters and workload clusters. So we can go ahead and test this out. However, we're not going to go ahead and deploy any clusters at the moment. But if we were to now go ahead and run Tanzu management cluster create --UI, this is going to spin up a little mini web server, and it's going to open up a web page. And at this point, we could now go ahead and pick our deployment model, whether it was going to be vSphere, AWS, Azure, and go through the installation process to now push out a Tanzu Community Edition Kubernetes cluster. A link at the bottom of this video will take you to my blog where you can find all the commands that I used to install and configure up this Bootstrap client. Thank you for sticking to the end of this video. I know there was a lot to get through in a very short time frame. I look forward to seeing you in my next video where we go ahead and deploy an actual Tanzu Kubernetes management cluster.